My name is Jim Noble. I am the Global Director of Insurance and the head of the Americas for Greater Than. Is predict and prevent a new trend? It is not new. It is almost as old as insurance is. The idea of insurance has always been to predict, on the underwriting side, is to predict the amount of losses that you're going to have and to be able to price accurately for those losses. What has changed dramatically over the last few years, and what has really brought predict and prevent back to the forefront, is the fact that we have so much more data to work with today, and being able to use data in a way that is much more accurate on the prediction side. And so once you can accurately predict, as we do with our crash probability score, what's going to happen in the future, then you can take concrete actions to actually prevent that loss from happening. In theory, it should make insurance much more profitable if it's used properly. There's been a lot of writing over the last few months about the fact that telematics has reached its maturity for insurance, and that the take rate, or the rate that people actually will install and use telematics, has reached its peak, and we've learned all that we can learn from the data. Absolutely nothing could be further from the truth. What we have reached is the plateau in level 1 telematics, or first generation telematics, where we're getting in-vehicle data that is really talking about the events that have happened during a trip, right? It's not really analyzing the whole trip. There's many gaps in the data that we're getting today. Where we work at Greater Than is in the second generation of telematics, where we're gathering much more data, where we're getting much more granular in the analytics of what's happening in the vehicle, and whether that's risky, whether it's sustainable, how the vehicle is moving through time and space. That gives a greater level of clarity to the underwriter. It gives a greater level of clarity to the risk manager, to the driver themselves, whether it's a personal driver or somebody who's driving for work purposes. We're really only at the beginning of this second leg of our journey, and where we'll be able to use in-vehicle intelligence in a much richer manner, with much more high fidelity than we have in the past. So I'm really excited about the future of telematics and where it's going to take the insurance business. So the talk about reaching a level of maturity is only the fact that we've reached our teenage years. We haven't even gotten to the grown-up years yet. How can we measure fleet sustainability outcomes? That's an interesting question, because in the past years, we've thought only about fuel consumption in fleet sustainability. But fleet sustainability is a much broader topic than only fuel consumption. It's about the types of materials that we use to build the vehicles. It's about vehicle life cycle. It's about how we dispose of the vehicle when the end of that life has come. Sustainability is a whole topic around vehicle management, not just fuel consumption. So the answer to your question is we must measure the complete carbon footprint of the vehicle. Now, a lot of that obviously has to do with how it drives down the road and how much carbon that vehicle is putting out. And also, relatively speaking, how much carbon is that vehicle putting out? So if the vehicle is built at a certain emission standards, is the driver influencing that in a good or a bad way, so that just because it says it should get X amount of miles per gallon, or it should put out X amount of carbon, Is that actually happening based on how the driver is driving? So we can measure that in real time and be able to report on that in real time. That's especially important as we move towards more reporting standards, whether it's in the EU or the US or across the globe. So being able to measure that is an important factor, but it also, we look at how does it affect the vehicle life cycle. How can we reduce CO2 emissions on the road? Again, is a very interesting question. I mean, obviously, it's the type of vehicles that we drive, but even if we drive a large, heavy vehicle or a small EV, the driver has a great deal of influence of how we reduce that carbon footprint of that vehicle. Interestingly, we always thought that if a driver drove safely, that they would have a better carbon signature. We're finding out, especially through our AI models, that that's not necessarily true. In the center, it is. In the center of the curve, a safe driver, it usually has lower emissions. But at the extremes, you can have a safe driver that doesn't necessarily have good carbon output on their vehicle. And the same way on the other side, where the carbon output is fairly good, but the driver doesn't necessarily drive safely, depending on what standard you're applying. So why is a safe driver not necessarily a carbon-friendly driver? And that has to do with how they control the vehicle. So say things like jackrabbit starts, but they're under what we would consider speeding. But they're heavy on the fuel pedal, or they're heavy on the brake pedal, or they're on and off the fuel pedal on a regular basis. They're keeping a good following distance, but they're on the fuel pedal and off the fuel pedal. They handle hills poorly from the way they manage the vehicle. So it's really vehicle management and how that driver influences that vehicle management, as opposed to, are they leaving enough space around their vehicle? Are they braking in plenty of time? Those types of things. So if you think of how you would measure a driver from events, which is traditionally how telematics thought about safe driving, those events may or may not be carbon friendly. Sustainability is still a very young topic. We talk about it in the mobility world, in the way we talk about new technology. So there are several things that are trending for sustainability in the mobile world. Number one is reporting on it. Yes, we've always kind of done reports around fuel mileage, consumption, those types of things, but they were always hedged in the type of vehicles that we used. Now that we can measure a driver's influence on sustainability, no matter what kind of vehicle they're using, or being able to benchmark driver to driver in a particular vehicle, it gives much more clarity. And so that's a new trend, to be able to measure down to the micro level of how a driver influences sustainability. And of course, that leads to the topic of reporting and the fact that whether it's in the EU or the US or around the globe, governments are developing, and even investment firms are developing, new reporting standards to be able to better understand the company's overall carbon footprint, not just how much fuel they use. Because that even counts in the EV world. So if my fleet is transitioned to EV, is that driver driving in a way that saves on battery consumption and battery life, which means less charging time and less usage? less usage of energy sources. So thinking about EV from a sustainability standpoint now is much more granular than it used to be. So that's a very, very new trend in how we think about sustainability. So if you add all those types of things together, and the fact that it is part of almost everybody's incentives now on how they, whether it's actually financial incentives or just their job performance incentives, that also is a very, very new trend. And if you add all that together, that puts a lot of attention on sustainability and where we'll go in the future. But again, it's very, very young. I expect a lot of changes over the next couple of years. The future of insurance is going to be very, very interesting. So what I see for the future of insurance depends on how vehicles develop. The one thing we know for sure is that we're going to be able to understand how vehicles operate at a much deeper level. The AI that we have at Greater Than obviously gives that kind of clarity. We had talked about that before. And the more data that comes out of the vehicle, the more clarity that we'll get around what is the risk of driving, where is that risk happening, whether, and I'm talking about geographical locations of rural areas or urban areas, those types of things. So being able to use the amount of data that's coming out of the vehicle, whether it's developed by the vehicle itself, whether it's developed by aftermarket devices, but being able to use that, which is exactly where Greater Than fits in, is being able to take that data and use it, is going to be very, very important to the development of motor insurance around the world. How we transition into the autonomous world, I think, is going to be very, very interesting. But again, it'll be about big amounts of data. And how do we understand what are the risks that are facing the insurance companies, and how do they handle that risk? Well, first of all, I think they have to make it a part of the insurance product, right? So how do we use sustainability in insurance? We talked a little bit about that, but I think as an incentive, insurance companies are in a unique position to help fleets and even individual users focus on sustainability. Now, what do they do? How do they do that? Do they do it with premiums? Do they do it with messaging? That remains to be seen. And I think that's in product development right now in insurance companies all over the world. But one of the things that we allow them to do is to get a clear view of how that driver is driving from a carbon footprint standpoint. So what is their influence on the CO2 output of the vehicle, no matter what vehicle they're driving? And if they use that as a measurement, then it becomes easier for them to develop products that help their customers focus on sustainability. So the data itself coming out of the vehicle really hasn't changed. But what has changed dramatically is the way, especially at Greater Than, that we can look at that data and turn it into information that's much more usable for insurance, whether it's underwriters, whether it's actuaries, even in the claims section, and especially in the risk management side. So we look at the data coming out not as bits and pieces of data. We put it together and look at it holistically. That's why we say driver patterns as opposed to driver events, because we're really looking at how the driver manages the vehicle through time and space. And once you do that, once you're looking at much more granular data than what we've looked at in the past, now you're getting into the second generation of not necessarily data, but information, and how that information can be used in the underwriting process. So for example, if I'm looking at our holistic data as an underwriter, I now have a very clear picture of the risk, the crash probability going forward of that individual driver or fleet or portfolio of business. And then with that clarity, I can do a much more accurate job of pricing. And then that dramatically affects my loss ratio, it dramatically affects my profitability, and it dramatically affects the kind of risks that I want to take on. So that's what I'm talking about with second generation. The second generation elevates the data that's coming out of the vehicle to a usable format that will help insurers become much more profitable.